Hello, and welcome to Saving Circle, where we help millennial professionals feel confident about managing their money. I'm your host, Vineet Prasad, an accredited financial counselor and the founder of Savings Academy. On today's episode, I'll answer a question I get from a lot of clients and friends. How much should you have in savings exactly? And this is an appropriate question for the inaugural episode of Saving Circle, given the show's name and that I love savings. So let's start with a rule of thumb that you may have heard. There's a rule of thumb out there that you should have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses as savings. And I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb, but I think there's some more detail and nuance that I'd like to add in there for you. The first thing is, what exactly is the 3 to 6 months of savings for? So you typically hear the word emergency fund thrown around, but the emergency fund, if that's your only main savings account, it ends up getting used for a bunch of other stuff. And this is something I've seen a lot when I work with people. Well, we start building up an emergency fund, but then we have a vacation, and so now it's back down to zero, and etc. So I'd actually recommend breaking it down into two pieces for your savings. The first one is that emergency savings account we talked about. And that is really for, I lost my job and I have to pay for my expenses until I get a new job, or something truly catastrophic that you couldn't have planned for. But usually it's that job loss is what the emergency fund is for. So that's why you get to that 3 to 6 months of expenses. And I recommend really specifically looking at the expenses that you know you'll need to pay, the obligations. So if you have obviously your rent, utilities, food, and any debt minimums that you have, because you'll likely have to keep paying those even if you lose your job. Just making sure that you look at all those monthly expenses that will happen, add those up, estimate those, and then in terms of how much exactly you need for this emergency fund, I do think 3 to 6 months is a good range. I think that in terms of where you should fall in the range, if you have not a lot of obligations, meaning you don't have a car that might have issues, you don't have a home, you don't have kids, then you can be closer to the 3 month end of the scale. If you do have a lot of those obligations, like a car that might break, a home that might need repairs, kids, then I go closer to the higher end of the range, 6 months. Now, that being said, the emergency fund ideally shouldn't be used for those expenses like car maintenance and home. Ideally, it should only be used for if you lose your job, but I still recommend going closer to the higher end of that range if you have a lot of those obligations. So that brings us to a second type of savings account, which is a revolving savings account. And this is one not a lot of people have, but I highly recommend. So a revolving savings account is kind of like a reverse credit card. It's money that you put regularly, monthly, into an account that you know you're going to spend soon or over the next year. And so for this, you take all the expense types that are more irregular and unusual, like a vacation. If you know you're going to owe taxes, it would go here. Any kind of tuition you'll owe in the next year, for example. Just these big unexpected expenses that can sometimes hit people and they're not ready for them and they go on a credit card. Instead, figure out how much those will be on average throughout the year, divide by 12, and then you get your monthly average. And that's how much you should be putting in to your revolving savings account to ensure that you have the money there when those expenses come around. And with the revolving savings account, you know that money is going in and you know that money is coming back out. So it's a two-way street. And that's all good. That's part of the plan. With the emergency fund, it really should be a one-way street. Money goes in and it doesn't come out unless you lose your job. Again, and if you haven't started building up your revolving fund yet, you might sometimes need to take money out of it in the early stage, but I really recommend trying to avoid that if at all possible. And then once you do take money from an emergency fund, start building it back up again. And if you're listening to this and you already have 3 to 6 months of savings in an emergency fund, great. If you're listening to this saying, oh, like that sounds like a lot, it's going to take me a long time, it's okay. And it's okay to start small, try to build up over time how much you can put each month into the savings account, and celebrate the small wins. Like actually track in terms of units of time, knowing, hey, this week, now I have 1 week worth of expenses in there, 1 week of financial freedom. Okay, now I have 2 weeks. So if I lost my job, I could, cover this amount of expenses. And over time, that kind of, as you build up that emergency fund, the breathing room kind of extends, and you just know, I'd be okay if an emergency happened, or if I lost my job or something like that. So I'm a really big believer in savings. I believe that it can be huge if ever you do lose your job. And that's why emergency savings are important, but the revolving savings are just as important, because for the things that you know are going to come up that are bigger expenses, I really like to just be able to have that money on hand and deploy it instead of, say, putting it on a credit card, for example. So that's my perspective on savings. That's everything I have for today. But thank you very much for checking out the show. And for more personal finance tips, you can always check out my website at savingsacademy.com. And if you found today's episode useful, I would greatly appreciate you leaving me a rating or review so that more people can learn about the show. And that's everything for today. Until next time, keep saving, my friends.